Alright, let's be honest. We all think of history's great commanders as 4D chess masters playing with human lives. But sometimes, they were more like toddlers with a book of matches and a god complex. Get ready for a tour of military decisions so jaw-droppingly idiotic they make ordering pineapple on pizza look like a stroke of genius. This isn't a story of heroes, it's a list of facepalms that echoed through eternity, proving that the deadliest weapon of all is a guy with a fancy hat and a terrible, terrible idea. 1. The Trojans' decorative horse. So after a decade of getting their butts handed to them, the Greeks pack up and leave. But they leave behind a gift. A wooden horse the size of a building. Now, a normal person would see a giant, unsolicited package from their sworn enemy and immediately introduce it to a very large bonfire. But the Trojans, high on victory and low on common sense, were like, "Free horse, get it inside." It was the ancient world's equivalent of finding a suspicious USB stick in the parking lot and immediately plugging it into your main server. By the time they heard the pitter-patter of murderous Greek feet coming from inside, it was way too late to check the return policy. 2. Xerxes' supply jam at Thermopylae. Imagine planning the biggest, baddest invasion in history. You've got more soldiers than you can count, a fleet that darkens the sky, and the ego of a rock god. Then your entire operation grinds to a halt because of a traffic jam. That's what happened to King Xerxes. His massive army and its even more massive supply train got stuck in the narrow pass at Thermopylae like it was the 405 freeway in Los Angeles on a Friday afternoon. While the Spartans were having their heroic last stand, the bulk of the Persian army was probably miles back, honking their chariot horns and arguing about who forgot to check the map. It was a logistical fender-bender of epic proportions. 3. Hannibal's Alpine starvation. Hannibal gets a 10 out of 10 for dramatic flair. Crossing the Alps with war elephants. Chef's kiss. Absolutely legendary. The problem? He apparently forgot to pack lunch. He dragged his entire army and a bunch of giant hungry pachyderms over the world's most inconvenient mountain range with what seems to be the catering budget of a child's birthday party. His soldiers were freezing, starving, and probably watching their elephantine siege weapons get thinner by the day. He planned a surprise party for Rome, but forgot to bring the cake, the presents, or enough food to not die on the way there. It was less a military campaign and more the world's worst camping trip. 4. Crassus's golden choke. Meet Marcus Crassus, a guy so rich he could probably buy a new personality, but instead decided he wanted to be a war hero like his cool friends. So he bankrolled his own private invasion of Parthia, marching into the desert like a tourist looking for a gift shop. The Parthians, who were actual desert warriors, proceeded to use his legions for target practice. When they finally captured Crassus, they allegedly gave him the one thing he loved most. They poured molten gold right down his throat. It's the most brutally sarcastic execution in history. A permanent, fiery solution to his thirst for wealth and glory. You have to admit, that's some next-level commitment to the bit. 5. The Varangian Guard's fatal chase. The Varangian Guard were the secret service of Byzantium. Stone-cold Viking badasses whose only job was to stand there and look terrifyingly unbreakable. But during a key battle, a few enemy Normans faked a retreat. The Varangians, in a moment of pure Leroy Jenkins energy, completely forgot their training, broke their perfect formation, and charged after them. It was a trap so obvious a cartoon Coyote would have seen it coming. The Normans led them away from the main army and promptly turned them into Viking kebabs. They had one job. Be a wall. Instead, they got distracted by a shiny object and paid for it with their lives. 6. Australia versus emus. You haven't known true failure until you've declared war on a bird and lost. In 1932, Australia deployed actual soldiers with machine guns to handle an emu problem. The soldiers, probably thinking this was the easiest assignment ever, set up their guns and prepared for a turkey shoot. But the emus weren't having it. They were feathered ninjas, zigzagging across the battlefield, dodging bullets like they were in the Matrix. The military campaign was an expensive, humiliating disaster. The Australian government was forced to admit defeat. To this day, the emus remain undefeated, holding a 1-0 record against a national army. Let that sink in. 7. Napoleon's Russian holiday. Napoleon, the undisputed heavyweight champion of Europe, marched his giant army all the way to Moscow, fully expecting to arrive to a surrender ceremony and a fancy dinner. Instead, he found an empty city that the Russians had set on fire themselves. He was basically the guy who shows up to a party that was canceled weeks ago, standing alone in the driveway while the house burns down. He captured a pile of ash. The Russians just refused to play his game, ghosting him on a continental scale and letting General Winter do the dirty work. His grand victory was just sitting in a frozen, empty city, wondering where it all went wrong. 8. The Light Brigade's frontal fancy. The charge of the Light Brigade was the result of the world's worst game of telephone. An order was given to attack some vulnerable Russian cannons. But by the time the message got to the guy in charge, Lord Cardigan, it had mutated into YOLO, straight into the main, heavily fortified Russian artillery. Instead of questioning an order that was basically a death sentence printed on fancy paper, he just shrugged and led 600 of his men on a glorious, idiotic, head-on charge into a wall of cannon fire. It was the military equivalent of misreading a recipe and putting a cup of cyanide in the cake instead of a cup of sugar. Magnificent, brave, and utterly, profoundly stupid. 9. Spain's unsinkable armada. King Philip II of Spain decided he was going to teach England a lesson, so he built the biggest, most expensive navy ever conceived. We're talking 130 ships, decked out and lumbering across the ocean like floating cathedrals. They called it the Invincible Armada. The problem is, when you name something invincible, fate tends to take that as a personal challenge. The smaller, faster English ships darted around them, setting them on fire, while the Spanish tried to maneuver their giant, clumsy warships. Then, the weather, which apparently had money on England, kicked in. A massive storm smashed the Invincible fleet to bits against the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. It was God's way of saying, "Nice boat. Be a shame if something happened to it." 10. The Bay of Pigs. Sunbathing. The CIA cooked up a plan to overthrow Fidel Castro that was so secret, everybody in Miami seemed to know about it. They trained a small army of Cuban exiles and sent them to invade Cuba at a beach called the Bay of Pigs. They were expecting the Cuban people to rise up and join them in a glorious revolution. Instead, they were met by Castro's army, who had been waiting for them with machine guns and a very unwelcoming attitude. The promised U.S. air support never showed up, and the whole thing collapsed into a bloody, embarrassing fiasco in less than 3 days. It wasn't an invasion. It was the world's most poorly organized beach party, and the only thing on the menu was total defeat. 11. The Soviet-Afghan quagmire. In 1979, the Soviet Union looked at Afghanistan and thought, you know what? This will be easy. They planned a quick little operation to pop in, install a friendly puppet government, and be home before the snow melted. It was supposed to be a weekend project. 10 years later, they were still there, getting absolutely wrecked by Afghan rebels, the Mujahideen, who were using the mountains like their own personal playground. The mighty Red Army, with its tanks and helicopters, got stuck in a decade-long nightmare. It was a brutal lesson that some countries are just not interested in being invaded, no matter how nicely you bring your tanks over. 12. Hitler's Dunkirk coffee break. The German war machine in 1940 was on a roll. They had the British and French armies completely trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, backed up against the sea. The war was practically over. All they had to do was close the trap. Then, for reasons that still make historians want to tear their hair out, Hitler ordered his tanks to stop. Just stop. Maybe he wanted to save the tanks. Maybe he thought the Air Force could handle it. Whatever the reason, it was the single greatest gift he ever gave the Allies. This bizarre pause gave Britain enough time to scramble every boat, yacht, and fishing vessel they could find to pull over 330,000 soldiers off that beach. It was a strategic error of such epic stupidity, it's a miracle it happened at all. 13. Japan's Pearl Harbor provocation. The Japanese military had a brilliant idea. They figured if they sailed across the Pacific and delivered a knockout punch to the US Navy at Pearl Harbor, the Americans would get scared and stay out of their business. Tactically, the attack was a stunning success. Strategically, it was like trying to put out a small fire with a gallon of gasoline. They didn't just sink a few battleships, they woke up a country that had been determined to mind its own business and gave it a single, furious purpose. Admiral Yamamoto, the man who planned it, supposedly said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." He wasn't wrong. That was perhaps the biggest understatement of the entire war. 14. Mussolini's Greek snowfall. Benito Mussolini, Italy's famously insecure dictator, wanted to prove to his pal Hitler that he could conquer places too. So he decided to invade Greece. He launched his brilliant attack in late October because apparently nobody in his inner circle owned a calendar or had ever heard of winter. His poorly equipped army marched right into the freezing mud and snow of the Greek mountains and promptly got their clocks cleaned by the Greek army. The invasion was a humiliating, frostbitten disaster. It was so bad that Hitler had to postpone his own invasion of the Soviet Union to come down and bail Mussolini out, a decision that would later cost him dearly. It was a masterclass in how to fail through pure, arrogant incompetence. 15. The Ottoman frostbite of Vienna. The Ottoman Empire rolled up to the gates of Vienna in 1683 with an army big enough to blot out the sun. They were the undisputed champions of sieges and were ready to add the heart of Europe to their collection. They settled in for a long siege, completely confident that the city would fall. What they didn't count on was the Polish king, Jan Sobieski, showing up with the largest cavalry charge in history. The Ottomans were caught completely by surprise and were routed so badly they left everything behind in their camp, including tents, cannons, and sacks of weird little beans. The Viennese figured out how to roast and brew them, and thus the coffee house was born. The Ottomans came to conquer an empire and accidentally started Europe's caffeine addiction. 16. Ramesses' Kadesh miscalculation. Pharaoh Ramesses II had an ego that could be seen from the moon. Convinced he was a military god-king, he led his army to Kadesh to fight the Hittites. His scouts told him the enemy was still 100 miles away, so Ramesses, being the impatient genius he was, raced ahead with just one division. Surprise! The entire Hittite army, thousands of chariots and all, was hiding just over the next hill. Ramesses went from planning his victory parade to being in the middle of a massive ambush. He spent the rest of the day fighting for his life, a terrifying experience he later spun into a heroic tale of his own greatness on every temple wall he could find. A classic case of fake it till you make it, after almost getting himself completely wiped off the map. 17. Attila's halt before Chalons. Attila the Hun. The guy's nickname was literally the Scourge of God. His entire brand was built on burning, looting, and generally being the most terrifying person on the planet. So at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, a chaotic free-for-all between his forces and a coalition of Romans and Visigoths, he had a golden opportunity. His enemies were distracted, their flank was wide open, and he had a clear shot to crush them. It was the game-winning touchdown pass, and he just didn't take it. He held his army back. Nobody is sure why. Maybe he had a sudden philosophical awakening. Maybe he saw a squirrel and got distracted. Whatever the reason, the most feared warlord in the world choked at the critical moment, losing his momentum and his reputation as an unstoppable force of nature. 18. The Mongol typhoon surprise. The Mongols, under Kublai Khan, had basically conquered the entire Asian continent on horseback. They were unstoppable. So naturally they thought, hey, let's try boats, and decided to invade Japan. They assembled one of the largest fleets the world had ever seen and sailed off, probably assuming the ocean would be as easy to conquer as northern China. Well, the planet had other ideas. Twice they tried to invade, and twice a massive typhoon appeared out of nowhere and smashed their fleets into firewood. The Japanese called it the kamikaze, or divine wind, and it pretty much single-handedly saved them. It turns out the one enemy the Mongols couldn't defeat was really, really angry weather. 19. The Karelian Death March. The Swedish army of the early 1700s was considered the baddest on the block. They were disciplined, tough, and won everything. That is, until they met the Russians at Poltava and got absolutely wrecked. Broken and defeated, the surviving soldiers needed to get home. Some bright spark in command suggested they take a shortcut over the mountains. In the middle of winter, it was the 18th century equivalent of your GPS leading you into a lake. This shortcut became a frozen, nightmarish disaster where thousands of elite soldiers either froze solid, starved, or just plain walked off a cliff in a blizzard. It was less of a strategic retreat and more of a long, miserable, hypothermic conga line to the afterlife. 20. Santa Anna's split at San Jacinto. General Santa Anna of Mexico was a man with a colossal ego and a love for a good afternoon nap. After winning a few victories against the rebellious Texans, he got a little cocky. At San Jacinto, he decided to split his forces and let his men take a siesta in the middle of the day, right in enemy territory, without posting enough lookouts. The Texans, who were not napping, launched a surprise attack. They overran the Mexican camp in about 18 minutes while half the army was still trying to figure out where their pants were. Santa Anna himself was captured the next day, hiding in the bushes dressed as a common soldier. It was perhaps the most consequential bad nap in history. 21. The Dien Bien Phu mud trap. The French military in Vietnam had a brilliant plan to lure the Vietnamese army into a decisive battle. They built a massive, state-of-the-art fortress in a valley at a place called Dien Bien Phu. A fortress in a valley. They basically built their base in the bottom of a giant bowl. When the monsoon season hit, their impenetrable fortress turned into an inescapable mud pit. Their tanks got stuck, their trenches flooded, and the Vietnamese, who had cleverly dragged their artillery up the surrounding hills, just sat up there and rained shells down on them. The French literally dug their own grave and then waited for the rain to fill it up. 22. Flodden's Highland Charge. The Scottish Highlanders had one signature move, the glorious, terrifying downhill charge. It worked great when you were coming down a foggy hill on unsuspecting victims. It worked less great at the Battle of Flodden Field. Facing a disciplined English army on flat, open ground, they decided to do their one move anyway. The English, armed with longbows and massive pikes, just stood there as thousands of screaming Scotsmen ran across a muddy field directly into a wall of pointy steel and a cloud of arrows. It was a tactical disaster of such magnitude that it wiped out a huge portion of the Scottish nobility, including their king. It was a brutal lesson that sometimes you need more than one play in the playbook. 23. The Raid on the Medway. The English were so confident in their navy's power that they decided to save some money by just not preparing for an attack. Most of their warships were parked in the River Medway, basically unguarded. The Dutch, seeing this as the opportunity of a lifetime, just sailed right up the river, burned most of the English fleet where it sat, and even towed away the flagship, the Royal Charles, as a souvenir. The King of England was reportedly in a full-blown panic. It was the 17th century equivalent of finding your car on cinder blocks in your own driveway. It was so humiliating it's a wonder the entire island didn't just sink into the sea from sheer embarrassment. 24. Alcaser Quibir's Lost Conquest. Sebastian of Portugal was a young, fanatically religious king who thought he was the star of his own action movie. He decided he was going to lead a glorious crusade into Morocco. With no real experience, no solid plan, and an army that was not prepared for the North African heat, he marched into the desert looking for glory. He found the army of the Moroccan Sultan instead, which proceeded to utterly annihilate the Portuguese. The battle was so catastrophic that not only was the army destroyed, but the king himself was killed, along with most of Portugal's nobility. The disaster was so complete that it ended Portugal's royal dynasty and led to the country being taken over by Spain for the next 60 years. Talk about having a bad day. 25. The Chosen Reservoir Encirclement. U.S. command in Korea had a serious case of victory fever. General MacArthur was so confident he told his troops they'd be home by Christmas. The Chinese army, however, had not been invited to the victory party. They secretly surrounded the U.S. Marines high in the frozen mountains of the Chosen Reservoir. The Marines woke up one morning to find themselves outnumbered 10-1 and encircled. It was a strategic blunder of such magnificent proportions that it led to one of the most brutal fighting retreats in military history. The Marines famously quipped, "We're surrounded. That simplifies our problem," which is the most hardcore thing you can say when your boss has accidentally sent you to the world's coldest, deadliest trap. 26. The Qing's Opium War naval loss. When Britain showed up to China in the mid-1800s with modern, steam-powered warships, the Qing dynasty responded by sending out their fleet of traditional wooden junks. This was not a battle. This was a technology demonstration. It was the military equivalent of a medieval knight trying to joust with a battle tank. The British ships could sail against the wind, fire explosive shells, and generally run circles around the Chinese fleet while being completely out of range of their cannons. The Qing dynasty learned a very hard lesson that day. Centuries of tradition don't count for much when the other guy shows up with a steam engine and a really bad attitude. 27. The Falklands Gamble. In 1982, Argentina's military government decided to invade the Falkland Islands, a tiny windswept British territory 8,000 miles from London. They gambled that the British Empire was old and tired and wouldn't bother fighting for a few remote islands full of sheep. This turned out to be a massive miscalculation. Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, responded with the fury of a disturbed hornet's nest. Britain assembled a massive task force and sailed it all the way to the South Atlantic to take the islands back. Argentina didn't just poke a sleeping bear, they kicked it in the shin, stole its wallet, and were then genuinely shocked when the bear woke up and mauled them. 28. Curupati's Allied Blunder. During the War of the Triple Alliance, the combined armies of Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay felt pretty confident about attacking the Paraguayan fortress of Curupati. It looked like a straightforward assault. What they failed to notice was that the Paraguayans had dug a massive, hidden trench system right in front of the main walls, a perfectly camouflaged kill zone. The Allied soldiers charged forward and fell directly into this man-made ditch, where they were trapped and mowed down by cannon and musket fire. Thousands died in less than an hour. It was a trap so simple and so brutal, it was like something out of a Looney Tunes cartoon, only with a much, much higher body count. 29. The Asia Minor Overreach. After winning World War I, Greece got a little greedy. They decided to take a huge chunk of Anatolia from the collapsing Ottoman Empire. Their army marched deep into Turkish territory, stretching their supply lines to the breaking point. They were overconfident, overextended, and had basically walked across the entire country to pick a fight. Then, the Turkish army, under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, hit them with a massive counterattack. The Greek army collapsed and was chased all the way back to the sea. It was a classic case of a guest who comes to dinner, decides they like the house, and then gets thrown out the front door by the homeowner. 30. The Dobro Pole collapse. By 1918, the Bulgarian soldiers on the Macedonian front had been fighting for years and were pretty much over it. They were tired, hungry, and poorly supplied. So when a combined force of Serbian and French troops launched a major offensive at a sector called Dobro Pole, the Bulgarian line didn't just bend, it evaporated. The soldiers basically said, "Nope, we're done," and the entire front disintegrated. It was less of a strategic breakthrough and more of a collective resignation. The collapse was so sudden and so total that it knocked Bulgaria out of the war almost overnight, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply giving up. 31. The Stalingrad flank collapse. When the Germans launched their all-out assault on Stalingrad, they put their toughest, best-equipped troops in the city center. For the long, boring job of guarding the flanks out on the open steppe, they used their less-equipped allies, mainly Romanian and Italian divisions. The Soviet Marshal Zhukov saw this and had a moment of pure evil genius. He ignored the German strongpoint and instead launched a massive pincer attack, Operation Uranus, directly on the weak flanks. The Romanian divisions, facing an overwhelming onslaught of Soviet tanks, crumbled almost instantly. The Germans had built a door of solid steel but left the hinges made of wet cardboard. 32. The Sicilian expedition disaster. Athens in the 5th century BC was on top of the world. They were rich, powerful, and had an ego the size of the Parthenon. So they decided, for reasons that were mostly just showing off, to launch a massive naval invasion of Sicily. It was an incredibly expensive, long-distance campaign with no clear goal. It was the ancient world's fire festival. Everything went wrong. Their best general got recalled on trumped-up charges, they got bogged down in a pointless siege, and their entire fleet was eventually trapped and annihilated. It was a completely self-inflicted catastrophe that bled Athens dry and marked the beginning of the end of its golden age, all because of a national-level case of "hold my beer." 33. Pickett's pointless charge. On the third day of the Battle of Gettysburg, Confederate General Robert E. Lee decided on a plan of beautiful simplicity and terrifying stupidity. He ordered General George Pickett to take about 12,500 men and charge directly across a mile of open field into the very center of the Union Army's fortified line. It wasn't a feint. It wasn't a clever maneuver. It was just walking straight at the guys with all the cannons. The Union soldiers just stood there, watched them come, and then proceeded to blast them off the face of the earth. It was a glorious, suicidal, and utterly pointless act that achieved nothing except losing the battle and pretty much the entire war. It was the military equivalent of trying to stop a freight train by standing on the tracks and yelling at it. 34. The Kalka River misstep. When the Mongols first showed up on the edge of Europe, the princes of the Kievan Rus saw them as just another bunch of steppe nomads. A united army of Rus princes marched out to meet them, feeling pretty good about themselves. The Mongols employed their favorite tactic, the fake retreat. They pretended to run away, drawing the overeager Rus army on a chaotic chase for days. Then, at the Kalka River, the Mongols turned around and revealed the trap. The disorganized, exhausted Rus army was completely surrounded and systematically slaughtered. It was a brutal introduction to the Mongol way of war, a lesson paid for in blood for underestimating the new guys on the block. 35. The Tannenberg Trap. The Teutonic Knights were the picture of medieval arrogance, armored, disciplined, and utterly convinced of their own superiority. At the Battle of Tannenberg, they faced a combined Polish-Lithuanian army. The Knights charged forward, expecting another easy victory. But the Lithuanian wing of the enemy army suddenly broke and fled. The Knights, smelling blood, broke their perfect formation and chased after them. Big mistake. It was a planned retreat, a trick as old as time. The fleeing Lithuanians led the overextended Knights right into a swampy, wooded area where the Polish heavy cavalry was waiting to slam into their flank. The unbeatable order was encircled and crushed, a victim of their own pride and a perfectly executed sucker punch. 36. The Huaihai Stalemate. During the Chinese Civil War, the nationalists launched what they thought would be the decisive campaign to crush the communists. They had more men and better equipment. The problem was their generals coordinated with each other about as well as a bag full of angry cats. Different commanders refused to help each other, orders were confusing, and the whole offensive ground to a halt due to infighting and terrible weather. The communists, meanwhile, were far more disciplined and took full advantage of the chaos. The nationalists managed to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, not because they were outfought, but because they were outmanaged in the most spectacular fashion. 37. Gallipoli's landing wrong turn. The plan for the Gallipoli campaign was already risky, but the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the Anzacs, made it infinitely worse right from the start. They were supposed to land on a relatively flat, open beach. Instead, due to darkness and strong currents, they landed about a mile off course at the base of a series of steep, rugged cliffs. Instead of a surprise attack, they found themselves scrambling up a nearly vertical hillside directly into the guns of the waiting Turkish defenders. The entire element of surprise was lost before the sun even came up. It was the military equivalent of planning a surprise party but accidentally breaking down the host's front door with a marching band at 3 in the morning. 38. Market Garden's Bridge Too Far. The Allies in 1944 came up with a bold, complex plan called Operation Market Garden. The idea was to drop thousands of paratroopers behind enemy lines to capture a series of key bridges in the Netherlands, allowing ground forces to race forward and end the war by Christmas. It was a plan that required everything to go perfectly. Naturally, almost nothing did. The paratroopers were dropped too far from their targets, the ground forces got bogged down in traffic, and the final bridge at Arnhem proved to be a bridge too far. It was an audacious gamble that fell apart due to bad luck, bad intelligence, and a logistics plan that was more wishful thinking than actual strategy. 39. The Samurai's Dual Invitation. When the Mongols tried to invade Japan, the samurai warriors, who lived by a strict code of honor called Bushido, had a very specific way of doing things. You were supposed to ride out, announce your name and lineage, and challenge an opponent of equal rank to a noble one-on-one duel. So they tried this with the Mongols. They rode up and started yelling their resumes. The Mongols, who did not care one bit about honorable duels, just looked at them, shrugged, and responded with a massive, coordinated volley of arrows and explosive grenades. The samurai's code of honor met the Mongols' code of winning, and the results were messy, confusing, and very one-sided. 40. Cleopatra's Actium Bailout. The Battle of Actium was supposed to be the decisive showdown between the forces of Octavian and the combined fleets of Mark Antony and his lover, Queen Cleopatra of Egypt. The fate of the Roman world hung in the balance. But as the battle raged, Cleopatra, for reasons still debated, decided she'd had enough. She took her entire squadron of 60 Egyptian warships and just left. She bailed, right in the middle of the fight. Mark Antony, seeing the love of his life sailing away, apparently lost his mind, abandoned his own flagship, and chased after her. His leaderless fleet, confused and demoralized, quickly surrendered. It was perhaps the most famous case of "I'm taking my ships and going home" in all of military history. 41. The Winter War Supply Freeze. When the Soviet Union invaded tiny Finland in 1939, they expected a walk in the park. They sent their troops over the border in the dead of winter, assuming their massive numbers would overwhelm the Finns in a matter of weeks. They did not account for two things: the Finnish will to fight, known as sisu, and the brutal Arctic cold. The Soviets' supply lines froze solid. Their tanks ran out of fuel, their soldiers ran out of food, and their winter gear was hopelessly inadequate. The Finns, on skis and dressed in white camouflage, appeared out of the snow, destroyed entire Soviet divisions, and then vanished back into the forest. It was a masterclass in how a determined underdog can defeat a lumbering giant by letting the weather do half the work. 42. The Abyssinian Mountain March. Mussolini's second attempt at imperial glory was the invasion of Ethiopia, then called Abyssinia. He sent a modern mechanized army to do the job. The problem is that Ethiopia is not a flat, friendly parking lot. It's a country full of rugged mountains and deep gorges. The Italians brought all their fancy tanks and heavy trucks, which promptly got stuck on narrow, winding mountain paths that weren't designed for anything wider than a goat. The glorious, swift invasion slowed to a crawl, becoming a logistical nightmare of pushing, pulling, and cursing at vehicles that were completely useless in the terrain they were supposed to conquer. It was a perfect example of bringing the right tools for the wrong job. 43. The Anglo-Zanzibar War. This one holds the record for the shortest war in history, and for good reason. It was less of a war and more of a sternly worded disagreement that got out of hand very quickly. When the Sultan of Zanzibar died, his successor wasn't the guy Britain wanted. So the British sent a few warships to the harbor and told the new Sultan to stand down. He refused, and holed up in his palace with his army and his royal yacht. At 9:02 a.m., the British opened fire. By 9:40 a.m., the palace was on fire, the Zanzibar army had surrendered, and their one and only warship had been sunk. The entire conflict lasted 38 minutes. It was the most efficient and possibly most lopsided military action ever recorded. 44. The Battle of Karansebes is what happens when your army's worst enemy is itself. While waiting for the Ottomans, a drunken argument over schnapps led to a gunshot. In the chaos, someone screamed, "Turks!" triggering a catastrophic panic where the army started shooting at shadows and each other. The real Ottoman army arrived 2 days later to find thousands of Austrian casualties. They won the battle without firing a shot because their enemy had kindly done all the hard work for them. And that's our showcase of historical face palms. It proves that a fancy uniform and a giant map don't automatically grant you common sense. Now for the real debate, and I expect absolute chaos in the comments. What is ultimately more destructive and unforgivable? A single, catastrophic act of battlefield stupidity like Pickett's charge, or a prolonged, arrogant failure of logic like Napoleon's entire Russian campaign? Argue it out below. And while you're down there, deploy a tactical strike on that like button and subscribe for more strategic stupidity.